E-cigarettes are the latest innovation in nicotine delivery products to fly the harm reduction flag. They follow the massive failures of cigarette filters. Over decades, filters falsely reassured millions of smokers that they were reducing their exposure to harm and so could keep on smoking. We also had the lights and miles fiasco, which saw 80% of Australian smokers select those misleadingly labelled brands. These were outlawed by the ACCC from 2005 as a consumer fraud. Along the way, we also saw reduced carcinogen brands and even asbestos-filtered cigarettes in the Kent brand. We saw massive publicity about harm reduction from filters and low tar and massive consumer uptake of these products, but we didn't see a blip in the incidence of tobacco-caused disease in those who kept smoking. Thanks to harm reduction arguments, countless smokers continued smoking who might otherwise have quit. The tobacco industry drove these arguments and was supported by many in public health who thought that they were no-brainers. Nigel Gray, a giant of global tobacco control, admitted that the decades-long well-intentioned low-tar harm reduction policy was in fact a disaster. But meanwhile, we continued with the core policies of trying to prevent uptake, encourage quit attempts and denormalise smoking via smoke-free policies to protect non-smokers. Together, these objectives have delivered Australia the world's lowest smoking prevalence, although Dennis overnight sent me a slide suggesting that Canada may have just got ahead of us again. For 35 years, since the 1980s, we have seen a continually falling incidence rates of tobacco-caused disease. Female lung cancer rates seem likely to never reach even half the peak we saw with males. And awkwardly for some, Australia has become a world leader in reducing smoking without any major network of smoking cessation clinics or embracing e-cigarettes. Today, demands are being made to rush in soft-touch regulation to allow e-cigarettes to be manufactured, flavoured, promoted and used virtually without restriction. This is all being done on the shoulders of an argument that insists that after 50 years of tobacco control, there remain many smokers who can't or don't want to give up their nicotine dependence, and that in just a few years, sufficient evidence is already accumulated to show that e-cigarettes are both benign and great for cessation. But the can't quit argument has received remarkably little critical interrogation. We know that globally, hundreds of millions of heavily dependent smokers have quit since the early 1960s, most without any assistance at all. We know that today's smokers smoke fewer cigarettes per day than at any time in the past, which is exactly the opposite of what the hardening hypothesis would predict. The demands of the "we don't want to quit and we love nicotine" vaping activists to access e-cigs and to use them without restrictions must be balanced against the risks of what these demands might mean for population-wide progress toward the goal of keeping smoking heading south. Comprehensive tobacco control is not just about the preferences of vapers. It is most importantly about continuing to starve the tobacco industry of its current customers and most particularly of new recruits to ensure that smoking is made history. If we think of e-cigarettes as a transformative genie in a bottle, we need to think very carefully before letting it out, because putting genies back in bottles is much more difficult than just impulsively letting them out. If they prove to be benevolent, then all is fantastic. But if they bring false hopes and keep many people smoking, we may be looking at the early days of a third major false god of tobacco harm reduction. That genie is well out of the bottle in England and the USA, and other countries need to watch what is happening there very closely. Today, I want to examine 4 cornerstones of the public health case being megaphoned for e-cigarettes. The first is that e-cigarettes are benign and that nicotine risks are, as Robert West has put it, like drinking coffee or something. Now, no one sensible makes the argument that e-cigarettes are likely to be even remotely as harmful as smoking. The 2015 Public Health England report endorsed the 95% less harmful than smoking estimate. They took this from a consensus report which was authored by 12 people. 6 of these were subsequent signatories to the 53 signature letter to Dr. Margaret Chan at the WHO calling for minimal regulation. 6 had no research track record or experience in tobacco control whatsoever. 2 had financial ties to the tobacco or e-cigarette industries. There was no transparency about how this group was selected, but it was plainly not a group which was ever likely to produce a consensus that was anything but glowing about e-cigarettes. But let's assume for a moment that they may have been in the risk comparison ballpark. If e-cigarettes are 5% less harmful than cigarettes, we would only see 300,000 deaths a year globally from e-cigarettes instead of 6 million if every smoker switched. On present trends, England's Robert West suggests that e-cigarette growth may have already plateaued in England. That scenario of every smoker switching is as likely as pigs flying. A far more likely scenario, as I will argue shortly, is one that sees a continuing stream of smokers quitting, mostly unaided, as they always have, perhaps significant numbers attributing their quitting to e-cigarettes, but a slowing in overall quit attempts as many dual-using vaping smokers keep smoking at reduced rates in the erroneous belief that they are actually reducing harm. The quality of evidence we have for declaring cigarettes to be benign has been described in another review as very poor. This 2014 review concluded, due to many methodological problems, severe conflicts of interest, the relatively few and often small studies, the inconsistencies and contradictions in results, and the lack of long-term follow-up, no firm conclusions can be drawn on the safety of e-cigarettes. However, they can hardly be considered harmless. Now, the health problems caused by tobacco develop over decades. Every year will bring us more and more information about what the consequences might be of the typical daily vapour inhaling nicotine, propylene glycol, and an unregulated cocktail of fine and ultrafine particles like flavouring agents which have been approved for ingestion in foods but not for inhalation, an average of 120 times a day. That's 43,800 times a year. We will also see what the International Agency for Research in Cancer in Lyon has to say about whether nicotine is carcinogenic, having declared in 2014 its assessment to be one of its forward priorities. So how good are e-cigarettes for smoking cessation? Earlier this year, a paper co-authored by 5 of England's best tobacco control researchers, including Anne McNeil and Robert West, reported the world's first prospective cohort data on the question of quitting via vaping versus other methods. Their data are of great importance because by distinguishing daily from non-daily vapors, they allow the differentiation of casual and experimental users from daily vapors. Their study also provides data on outcomes 12 months later. The paper commenced by noting that smoking prevalence in England has been declining from 20% in 2012 to 18.4% in 2014, and in 2014 smoking cessation rates were the highest since 2008. This is the author's abstract. This simultaneous increase in e-cigarette use and cessation may be coincidental, and it's therefore vitally important for longitudinal studies to be conducted to assess the impact of e-cigarette use on quitting behaviour. So what did the study find? Well, I quote again from the abstract. Daily use of e-cigarettes while smoking appears to be associated with subsequent increases in rates of attempting to stop smoking and reducing smoking, but not with smoking cessation. And non-daily use of e-cigarettes while smoking does not appear to be associated with cessation attempts, cessation or reduced smoking. Now, a companion paper broke down the data further by type of e-cigarette product. Daily tank system users were the only group which showed a significant improvement in smoking cessation. But of the 1,643 smokers followed up for 12 months, only 69, or just 4.2%, were daily tank vapors at 12 months, and just over 1 in 4 of these, or only 1.2% of the total sample, had quit. This is hardly the stuff of revolutionary dreams for population-wide cessation. In addition to the Anne McNeil studies I just mentioned, Robert West's group's Smoking Toolkit study has been monitoring tobacco use in England every month since 2007, including e-cigarettes since 2011. While the McNeil group has reported that the 2014 smoking cessation rates were the highest since 2008, the latest data from August in the Smoking Toolkit study show the lowest percentage of English smokers trying to quit since 2007. You can see there 31.6% is down from a high of 42.5% in 2007. Now, these two data sets thus appear to show quite different, perhaps incompatible results about the proportion of smokers making cessation attempts and actual cessation. Greater clarity on this issue is really badly needed. But if the net impact of e-cigarettes is that quit attempts fall and more stay smoking than those who actually quit with e-cigarettes, we may be seeing a repeat of the major harm reduction follies of the past. In August, the English Smoking Toolkit study also reported that the large majority, over 80% of e-cigarettes, are dual users. They also continue to smoke. Now, many vaping advocates downplay this gigantic elephant in the room with a sort of a fingers crossed optimism that dual use should always be seen as just a transitory phase that smokers go through before they quit smoking. As I will argue soon, the tobacco industry has other ideas about this. So putting these studies together for England, which I would call e-cigarette central, where in plain language are we today? Well, non-daily vaping has no impact on cutting down or quitting. Daily vapers make more quit attempts than the non-vaping smokers, but they don't succeed any better than those who don't vape. Daily tank vapers do better at quitting, but the numbers involved are very small, and 80 to 90% of vapers are dual users. And while all this has been happening, the Smoking Toolkit study reports that quit attempts among English smokers at large are the lowest since 2007. So moving on, do vaping smokers cut back more than non-vaping smokers? The Brose et al. Paper from England reported that at 12 months, 13.9% of daily e-cigarette users reduced cigarette smoking substantially. But let's turn that figure around. Even amongst those smokers who vaped daily, 86.1% did not even cut back smoking substantially. They too were dual users. That's how good e-cigarettes are at just reducing smoking. They are far less successful, for example, than workplace smoking bans, where we see 20% reduction from reduced smoking opportunities. I'm sure you'll agree that all big tobacco companies now selling both cigarettes and e-cigarettes must be simply mortified by this news. But does reducing daily smoking substantially, say more than 50%, reduce deaths from smoking-caused disease? Let's suppose that most daily sustained vapers did cut back substantially, which they don't. Would this be harm reducing? Now, we've known for decades that three synergistic variables, age of smoking onset, amount smoked, duration of smoking, are critical in predicting mortality from smoking. There is a dose-response relationship that no one disputes here. Those who smoke more are more likely to die from their smoking than those who smoke less. So from this, it's really understandable that many smokers believe that just as they know water to be wet, that cutting down the number of cigarettes that they smoke will reduce their harm. But this is actually quite a different claim. The epidemiological data on lifetime risk is about total pack years and doesn't consider the question of whether the cumulative risks of smoking can be reverse engineered by reducing. But there is actually large-scale research on this question, and it's not good news for the cutting down obviously reduces risk dogma. 4 cohort studies published since 2006 have reported on whether reducing smoking as opposed to stopping smoking altogether confers any mortality benefit. A Norwegian cohort of 51,000 people followed from the 1970s to 2003 found, quote, no evidence that smokers who cut down their daily cigarette consumption by more than 50% reduced their risk of premature death significantly. A Scottish study of 2 cohorts followed from the 1970s to 2010 also found no evidence of reduced mortality in reducers, but clear evidence in quitters, and concluded that, quote, reducing cigarette consumption should not be promoted as a means of reducing mortality. And the largest study from Korea, involving nearly 500,000 men, followed for 11 years, found no association between smoking reduction and all cancer risk, but a significant decrease in the risk of lung cancer, but with the size of the risk reduction being disproportionately smaller than expected. Vapers who keep on smoking, which is most of them, are fooling themselves if they think they are seriously reducing risk. I now turn to the future of vaping. Think of the children is a common sarcastic slur made daily by vaping activists across social media. These self-absorbed misanthropes, today's W.C. Fields clone equivalents in their disdain for children, could actually not care less about the implications of e-cigarettes for teenagers. All they care about is their unhindered access to unregulated vaping equipment and their rights to vape anywhere, in workplaces, next to you on planes, and presumably while driving the school bus, inside childcare centres and hospitals. They want access to flavours like gummy bears and bubble gum that would cause a riot at a 3-year-old's birthday party. Vape is apparently so close to pure air that any restrictions are totally unwarranted. All that matters is that vaping be allowed anywhere. In England, vaping by non-smoking kids is very uncommon. Nearly everyone agrees that's a self-evidently good thing. But the same thing cannot be said about the USA, where the data from the US National Youth Tobacco Survey show that while smoking continues to fall in the USA, e-cigarette use has been dramatically increasing since 2011 and is now way ahead of cigarette smoking. There are now some 67% more middle and high school kids vaping than are smoking. Apologists for teenage vaping try to argue that this is a good development. All those teenage vapers would have been smoking were it not for e-cigarettes. But the small problem with this argument, of course, is that the rise was not associated with the rise of dual or multiple tobacco or nicotine product use, and the decline in cigarette smoking had been falling before e-cigarettes even arrived. Some argue that there is no problem in having tobacco and nicotine naive youth taking up e-cigarettes and becoming addicted to nicotine. Others would prefer that authorities like the US Surgeon General and the International Agency for Research in Cancer, not vape shop owners and industry spin merchants, to assure us that there's nothing to worry about with such uptake. But as yet, these agencies have not made those declarations. Nearly all businesses survive and flourish by retaining existing customers and, critically, by stimulating new customers to start. If you sell tractors or sheep dip chemicals, you will have little expectation of finding new customers who don't own sheep or land where a tractor might be needed. But if you are selling products which have potential to be used by more than those already using them, you are vitally interested in non-users. Cigarettes and e-cigarettes fit that description perfectly. Leopards don't change their spots. For decades, the tobacco industry told us, and still does, that it is not in the least bit interested in teenage smoking. If British American Tobacco succeeds on getting its hands on the Cancer Council Victoria's teen smoking data, we can all be assured that it will keep the contents strictly within its opposition to plain packs division and never show the data to its salivating, capturing new smokers and vapors divisions. The global e-cigarette market today is a mixture of big tobacco-owned brands and those owned by start-up incumbents. The tobacco industry is rapidly acquiring those minnows it regards as likely to be most profitable and strategic. Wide-eyed vaping advocates would have us seriously believe that the tobacco industry, with its billions of dollars in assets and long history of acquisitions, will not somehow soon swallow up most of these, just as it did the small tobacco companies all over the world. No tobacco company currently acquiring e-cigarettes brands is desisting in any way from attacking effective tobacco control. Plain packs are being attacked. Every day, British American Tobacco bleats on Twitter about how high tobacco tax, the most important plank in comprehensive tobacco control policy, is causing more illicit trade. The message here is clear. Taxes should be lowered to make smoking more affordable and to arrest the unending brutal falls in smoking. Quite obviously, this is not an industry which wants smokers to stop smoking. It's an industry with a business plan to have smokers keep smoking and to also vape when they can't smoke. It's an industry that understands how to erode the nicotine consumption downtime caused by smoke-free policies that have badly reduced sales. And guess what? This is exactly what most smokers who vape are doing. The concept of e-cigarettes being a gateway into smoking has been rightly criticised as being imprecise and vague, often being little more than crude after, therefore because of reasoning. But glib dismissals of the rapid rise of teenage use in kids just try stuff, throwaway lines, ignores the many appeals of vaping to teenagers and the fact that youth smoking is the lowest on record. Increasingly, most kids don't just try smoking. A very useful model of how e-cigarettes may work as a catalyst for smoking has recently been published. The authors provide a causal hypothesis for the initiation of e-cigarette use and for the potential transmission of tobacco smoking that highlights the combined factors of perceived negligible risk, why not use it, they're not harmful, attractive taste options, lower price, inconspicuous use, you can hide the things, put them in your pocket, higher level of peer acceptance. This model, I think, could stimulate important research into understanding cigarette uptake and any apparent transition to smoking. We are well on track to see the end of the tobacco epidemic in this country. E-cigarettes may have a role in that. Time will tell. But there are major concerns about the core claims being made for e-cigarettes. Australia should consider any policy change in harm reduction very carefully indeed. We should all be open to quality evidence that might suggest that this time we have something different. But equally, we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Simon. That goes to prove that retiring increases productivity. First question.
Do you think that it's possible to produce electronic cigarettes at a government level unbranded, unpromoted, unmarketed, priced as a cessation aid, a subsidised medicine, and that tobacco is 10 times the price that it is now, do you think that that would mitigate the long list of risks that you so clearly outlined?
My own personal position is one that is very open, of course, to the evidence that's just rolling in, either showing that e-cigarettes are very useful in reducing harm and helping people quit. As we saw, the quality of that evidence at the moment is pretty poor, and the evidence that they are terrific in cessation is not really leaping off the page. So if that evidence were to move forward and start being far more optimistic, my attitude would be that we don't want to let the genie out of the bottle prematurely, but we should introduce a system of regulated access. I don't know about government manufacturing it. I don't see any precedents for that anywhere in the world, and I just don't think that that's realistic these days. But I think we do that for all other pharmaceuticals. We have a way of either tightening regulation or loosening regulation depending upon what we find under conditions of real-world use. And that's the way I think that I would want to go with e-cigarettes.
We've got time for one quick final question. Thank you.
Can I ask, there's from e-cigarette Central in the UK, they have potentially launching Voke, the new e-cigarette, and it's gone through approval for stage 1 as a medicinal e-cigarette. Have you got any views on that?
As you would have just heard, I think that is the route that I would feel most comfortable with. If e-cigarette companies want to put their data in front of the Therapeutic Goods Administration and go through the process that everyone else has to go through in making therapeutic claims, I think that would be fair and equitable.
Thank you. Thank you again, Simon.